afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. We're just going to get ourselves settled here. We have sort of a cast of thousands, but don't be scared. We're going to be really disciplined about how we do this. Welcome. My name is Debra Humphreys, and I'm the Vice President for Strategic Engagement at Lumina Foundation. And I am very pleased to have been invited to chair this session. Just make sure everybody's in the right place. This is On the Job, talking about history skills with employers. And I couldn't have been more pleased to have been invited to do this because it seems to me it's one of the really important issues if we're going to serve our students well, is to assure that no matter what degree they get, including history degrees, we enable them to successfully make that transition from their educational experience into success in whatever working environment they end up in or aspire to achieve. So let me say a little bit about how this is going to go. I'm going to just make a few framing remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Dan McInerney, who is really the brainchild behind this session, and he also will give some very brief remarks of framing. And then we will hear from this very esteemed panel of experts on various aspects of this question of the transition from history major into successful work. I'm not going to do extensive introductions of anyone, so I'm going to actually ask everyone to just introduce themselves as we move along. And I'm going to remind everyone we're going to be really tight on time, so Dan and I are going to be the ruthless timekeepers out there. And I would say that probably the most important voices and insights we're going to hear about are from recent history graduates who are our friends down at the end of the panel there. About their own experiences making that successful transition from their history major into a variety of really exciting job opportunities. So let me just say a word or two about Lumina Foundation and why we're interested in this topic. Those of you who may not know much about us, we're an independent private foundation based in Indianapolis. And we are committed to making opportunities for learning beyond high school available to everyone. We are trying to work with partners like the AHA and many others to create a system that is easier to navigate than the one we currently have, that delivers more fair and equitable results than the one we currently have, and that most importantly meets the needs, the nation's need for talent. That's a driving force behind our work. And the reason for that is we believe that credentials beyond high school are important to prepare people both for informed citizenship as well as for success in a global economy. So those two things are the underlying commitment behind our goal. Some of you may also know that we have organized our work over the past decade or so around a single time-limited quantifiable goal. And we've done that partly to focus our own efforts, but also because we have been really compelled by the economic research, which really does seem to suggest that our nation's future, both the health of our economy but also the health of our democracy, really depends on having at least 60% of working adults in America holding high-quality degrees or credentials beyond high school. There are a couple of things that I'm responsible for at Lumina Foundation, one of which is our efforts at strategic communications and helping the broader public understand this goal and why it's important, and also to coordinate and build out a body of work that has to do with what does a high-quality credential really looks like? How do we assure quality in a system that is as diverse and as fractured and as complex as the one we have? So I want to share a word or two about that because the conversation about employment and the skills people are developing is fundamentally part of our definition of what a high-quality credential is. We have a definition that I talk about as kind of, it's sort of elegant and easy to describe and very difficult to operationalize. That's part of my job. We have sort of a three-part test for what a high-quality credential is. One is that it has clear and transparent learning outcomes. And a lot of the people on this panel have been working for a long time through tuning and other projects to try to figure out how we can make more transparent what degrees mean, including history degrees. That's, for us, really important, that a degree isn't of high quality if you don't know what's in it, if you can't tell what it's trying to accomplish for the credential holder. The second is that a high-quality credential should be preparing people for success in employment, particularly in a really dynamic global economy. And I'll say a little bit more about the challenges in that in a minute. And then the third part of the test is that high-quality credentials should not only prepare students for that first job, but should position them to be able to continue learning over time, and to potentially position them to continue to get credentials and additional credentials over time if necessary. And that also has to do with our reading of the economic data and the dynamism of our economy and the increasingly even more urgent imperative that we are all constantly in need of learning. I think that the kinds of degrees that a good history program provides are precisely, if they're well designed, they should be providing exactly that kind of capacity to keep learning over time. So as part of the goal that we have to increase these high quality credentials, we also understand there's sort of two things that are preconditions to that, and they're pretty challenging right now. One is we cannot get there if we can't either sustain or perhaps now rebuild the public's confidence in the quality of our system of learning beyond high school, and that includes the confidence of employers that the degrees we're actually providing actually do certify that students have the skills that they need. So public confidence is declining. It is a complicated topic to talk about. I don't have a lot of time to talk about it today, but we believe that's important, and it's one of the reasons why this challenge of being able to articulate really clearly what the credential is so important. Because if we can't do that, not only to ourselves, but to the broader public, the confidence will continue to erode, and that without that confidence, we won't have the resources we need to really provide the high-quality credentials. The second is about transparency. The transparency is a sort of precondition to all of the other work that we're doing, and part of that transparency, the responsibility for that transparency falls on us as educators, faculty members, those who are designing our curriculums, and also our students and our alums. We all have a role to play in painting that picture of what our credentials really mean. So at Lumina, bringing together that commitment to quality, that commitment to transparency, and that realization about the need to exercise strong thought leadership to restore public confidence, we have invested in a whole family of projects, including the tuning projects that many of you might be familiar with. We actually have been investing for almost 10 years in tuning. I looked it up. We actually have spent $17 million with 20 different organizations, all supporting different aspects of tuning, in addition to work we have done on something called the Degree Qualifications Profile. And we're very proud to have supported AHA in its work on tuning. I think the work that AHA has done has been some of the most powerful of the tuning projects. And I'm thrilled that the momentum has continued over time with AHA. And one of the things that I'm particularly excited about in terms of AHA's role in the tuning project has been its commitment to demonstrating to that larger, broader public that it is not only career-focused kinds of majors that can, if well-designed, position people for success, that liberal arts degrees as well, in fact, may be very well positioned to provide exactly the skills and capacities that you need to succeed in a dynamic global economy. Couple of challenges, though, to that. And that is and these are challenges that we are working on now through a variety of additional grants, and I just want to mention about one or two of them. We know that the nature of work is changing extremely rapidly. And of course, that makes this challenge of defining what the skills are even more complicated, because it's not like we can do it, put it down on a piece of paper, and not revisit it pretty much constantly, because that's what's happening in the world of work. And also, the whole credentialing landscape is becoming more complicated. Where you obtain skills, where you get your skills authorized in various ways, whether it's badges or certifications or all kinds of ways in which we are developing skills and then having those skills certified beyond just the traditional degrees. You'll hear a little bit later on the panel about the Credential Engine project. Lumina has funded something called Credential Engine that is about both transparency and trying to help us make sense of and map out that more complicated credentialing landscape. I want to just mention two other projects that we've been involved in, and then I will turn it over to my colleagues. I mentioned the issue of the public confidence and the larger national narrative about post-secondary learning. And we are concerned about that. And we have done some research, some big data research about sort of trying to uncover, well, what are exactly the narratives that are out there that really have resonance beyond our circles? So what are people talking about, writing about? What are they saying about post-secondary learning, and how close is it to the vision that we have? So I don't have a lot of time to talk about it today, but if any of you are coming to the AAC&U meeting, the Association of American Colleges and Universities meeting later in the month here in town, I'll be doing a session on what we have learned about that narrative. The only thing that I will say is there's multiple narratives, and the issue of workforce preparation and economic education for employment is a powerful narrative, and it in fact runs through almost all of the others. So this topic could not be more important if we're going to connect our vision with what's already being talked about out there. Final thing I will say is that we have been supporting another project. It's been a little bit sort of under the radar because it's relatively new, but it's called the Quality Assurance Commons. And it is trying to develop a new way to look at the quality of programs, not institutions, but programs. And it is specifically trying to develop a way to gather data and assess whether a program is really providing essential employability skills. So that's a kind of keep your eye on that. That project, I think, is moving along. It's just starting a pilot with about 20 institutions, and I think it could actually have some really big impact on this larger conversation. So final thing I want to say is about what employers really want, and we're going to hear a little bit more from Dan and others about this. Prior to my coming to Lumina Foundation in about a year ago, I worked for the Association of American Colleges and Universities, and we facilitated a whole series of conversations with employers and about 5 or 6 different surveys of employers over about a decade. And one of the things that you see there is that notwithstanding all of the changes that are happening, technology, globalization, changes in the workforce, all of that, there are some really stable and important transferable skills that you hear from employers across all different kinds of professions and sectors of the economy, for-profit, not-for-profit. And many of them, things like analytic reasoning, written and oral communication, complex problem solving, ethical reasoning, are things that, if well designed, programs like good history programs can provide. But I will say that my experience over that whole 10-year period at AAC&U is too many of our colleagues simply say we're doing it, but don't show how we're doing it, right? They say, well, those are liberal arts outcomes, those are history outcomes, we're good, we got it. Well, we are no longer in a time where we can just say it. We have to absolutely be sure we're actually providing those skills, and then we have to show it. And I think that's one of the things that we're going to hear today is some of the ways in which programs can actually show how they are developing these skills, not just saying that they do. I noticed this morning, I want to quote a tweet that I saw literally just a couple of hours ago, a new job outlook survey from NACE, the National Association of Colleges and Employers, which affirmed yet again the same sort of sets of transferable skills. They tweeted out, employers responding to the 2018 job outlook survey said problem-solving skills and teamwork abilities beyond a strong GPA are what they most want to see on students' resumes. And so I thought that tweet really illustrated this question of our program, we can't just say our programs do it. We have to enable students to actually demonstrate that they know and can deploy these skills in real-world settings. So I will turn it over to Dan at this point, and then we'll move along with others. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Deborah, and Let me use this opportunity, speaking for the AHA, to thank the Lumina Foundation for their extraordinarily generous support over the years in developing these projects with our Disciplinary Association and the projects that have come out of this. I first worked on this project with the AHA beginning in 2012 with this tuning project, which asked faculty to articulate what students should know, understand, and be able to do when they finish a degree program. That's a pretty simple question, isn't it? And it's one that you would think academics would have an answer to. It takes time to formulate the answers to that. But it's a great head start in developing this sense of what we share among these disparate departments across the U.S., what we're trying to provide our students with, not just to make little replicants of ourselves, but how are we helping these students in a world where their time frame looks out to 2030, 2040, not just the next month or the next semester. Tuning led the AHA into a wide series of related projects focused on introductory courses, focused on assignment design, pathways through curricula, the assessment of student learning, demonstrating you're actually doing these things in your courses and in your program of study. But it's always struck me that there's been an additional need that we haven't addressed as well as we should have early in this project, and that's helping our students construct a persuasive narrative of their educational experience, something that they can share with a graduate school if they're going on for more education, with a private sector employer or with a public sector employer. What's the best way for our students to explain their work, their accomplishment, their skills in a history program to a variety of audiences outside of academic communities, instead of just talking to ourselves? All of this, in other words, involves problems of translation and, in a sense, bilingualism. How do academics talk to one another about the skills they're developing in a disciplinary program? What is it that employers are interested in? What's the language they use to talk about skills, proficiencies, talent? And that's what the yellow sheet that was at the entrance to the room tries to provide some resources for. These are resources from the AHA, especially its career diversity pages. If you're not familiar with these, you should be looking at these pages. What are historians doing with their degrees? Secondly, information that Debra mentioned from the Association of American Colleges and Universities, 5 different surveys since 2007 with employers. What are employers saying about their needs? Thirdly, references to the work of one of our panelists, Ron Painter, the National Association of Workforce Boards, and their Workforce Central site, which I've been looking at before this conference, a very valuable set of pieces of information there that I think will be of interest to those in the audience, and this organization, NACE, and its statements about the relationship between employers' needs and what the academy provides, along with additional resources. I put everything on a handout because this is basically what my students pay attention to when I'm giving a lecture in class. And I wanted to save time for all the other panelists. So please take this with you. If you're a faculty member and you're mentoring students on careers and graduate education, if you're a graduate student and you're looking at these questions too, I hope you can share this with your colleagues to give them a sense of where to look to catch up on this information about aligning academic skills with employers' needs. And with that, let me advance the slide to the next discussion with our colleagues Norm Jones and Bob Sheets.
Stand up because the sight lines are so bad. So.
You guys are going to stand up?
Well, I'm going to start this off. This is a Q&A. And we're talking about sight lines because we know that those of you on this side of the room can't actually see us. So I'll start this off, then I'll make Bob stand up, and then I'll sit down, and we'll figure this out somehow. At any rate, this session came to be because Bob and I have served together on the DQP Tuning Advisory Committee for the Lumina Foundation. And in the process, he has taught me a great deal. Bob is an architect of the credential engine. And if you haven't looked at the credential engine, you should go Google the thing. You will find that there are ways of describing yourselves that you never imagined possible. And so in our conversations, Bob convinced me as a historian that we needed his help as, what do you call yourself, an employment sociologist or something like that?
I go by many names.
Nice guy. But at any rate, that we should be having conversations that allow us to understand the ways in which the larger community looks for what we have, and understanding that quite often what we historians describe in our own inside lingo isn't necessarily what the rest of the world is talking about, even though we're all talking about the same thing. So that's the purpose of today. And so we historians have to learn to speak a new language, because we have all these skills. And as Bob keeps adding to my skill set, I'm always learning things that I can do that I didn't know that I could do. When I discovered I could do metadata analysis, I was extremely proud of myself. It makes me sound like some sort of scientific person. So at any rate, I've taken the history tuning outcomes, broken them into 3 kinds of outcomes, and I've got some questions for Bob. And so this is the first one. History majors are expected to understand a wide range of historical information and be able to explain continuity and change over time. Bob, how do you translate that into the business community's language?
Is that the question?
That's the question. That's the first one.
Oh my God. Anyway, well, first of all, I want to compliment the HA on your tuning efforts, because I think it's going a long way toward making the translations necessary between the business community and the universities. And let me also say, before I directly address that question, is the employer community is as diverse as the academic community. So imagine we're all communities of practice that speak in different languages. And so when I answer a question like this, I always want to start out by saying I only deal with the smallest segment of the business community that I work with. And in that context, I work with largely the business research and consulting businesses, largely employers that are disrupting major industries because they're startup companies. That's who I deal with and study and work with. In the context of that part, what I'm always what Norm's question refers to is an innovation-based economy. I've got to have, I'm going to call it strategic thinking. Strategic thinking requires critical thinking plus contextual knowledge. It's very difficult to be a critical thinker and know nothing about the context you're in. And what I really think about, like historians, is you combine the two. And it's hard to be, for innovation, you've got to get outside of your current context quickly and see the possibilities and constraints clearly. And to me, in that translation, but again, going back to my first comment about the business community is communities of practice that have, they do share some common words, some common language that the tuning and DQP are getting at, critical thinking, problem solving. But there's also unique ways of thinking and talking in different communities of practice. And the most important, the rules of evidence to demonstrate something like writing skills, communication skills are different in different segments of the employer community. So I would urge you, in furthering this out, do your homework. Go look at the job listings that you have, like many of you all have maybe a summary. Imagine at the top of your resume, you have a thing called a summary or a profile. Here's who I am. Here's what I'm looking for. Go out and find the job descriptions in that domain. Match up the exact language in that to what the language you're using. So tuning is a great translator, but you need to make the final mile to translate to that language. Second of all, your resumes are not pieces of paper. They're databases. They are being held throughout the World Wide Web. So think of your resume as a database, but also research databases of resumes for people like you who are having similar goals. But find the people who've already taken one step in your career move and show how they are presenting themselves as from a history background, and use that language as well. So just a couple ideas. And the last one, both of those, look at the anchors they're using for evidence of what you say you can do. And so many times we have competency-based resumes. they specify anchors. I did these things as evidence of I'm saying I'm a critical thinker. Anyway.
So the next question is that history majors are taught to think historically, recognizing the pastness of the past, emphasizing the complex nature of past experiences and the complex and problematic nature of the historical record. And is that something that we can translate?
I think so. Let me pick up that one. First of all, ditto everything I said before on the first question, but let me do one other thing. I was intrigued because I learned so much from Norm about how he does his own research and others. Think about the complex historical record. You all are actually analyzing structured and unstructured information to put together, to analyze something, right? And when I say structured information, it is structured in the sense of it's text that is structured, it's quantitative information, but also you're dealing with very unstructured things that you're tagging. I call it metadata, right? We're actually describing objects in the world. What I'm seeing now is in most domains, there's a high demand for not computer science, but think of information sciences. Information sciences in which somebody has some knowledge of a domain and can help organize that information and present it for a variety of uses. Historically, those have been in cultural institutions. Think of libraries, museums, historical societies. They're now being done in every sector to organize massive domain knowledge in a new way and present it. Think of the big media companies. Think of the big search engines. Think of all this. And so it's really taking your analytical skills as historians and your contextual knowledge of a domain and applying it in a new way.
Thank you. History majors develop skills in critical thinking and reading, formulating questions, and constructing well-written historical arguments. And how do we make use of those when we're selling ourselves to a different community?
Another question. First of all, I'm going to go back to what Debra said, mentioned. We all talk the language of, I teach communication skills, I teach writing skills. And then if somebody was to take the evidence of that and give it to an employer, what would they think? Would that be good indications for what they mean by communication skills, for writing skills? And I would urge you to think in terms of giving your students, either through assignments or whatever, to be able to demonstrate those skills for their expected application domain, not yours. So think about, in the academic world, my biggest understanding was when in going over into the consulting world, I thought, well, what I needed to write, that what my professor thought was adequate writing would be adequate writing there. And what I said, everybody had different rubrics or different measuring sticks, right? And so the issue is you need to provide, that's why this is important to think about the student, your students having not an academic goal, but a non-academic goal with a profile that's at the top of their resume. And let's say they say great communication skills, always give them the opportunities to develop evidence of writing in ways that are given high ratings for the domain of their use. If I'm writing in a media environment, if I'm writing a business research report, those are two different applications. So I would urge, in terms of critical thinking, got it. Reading, I mean, all this, it's in spades in our liberal arts and science, our history, and our social science. It's just that the way in which we produce the evidence for that may not be as always rated as highly in a different context other than the university context. The second part of that I'd like to add is many times I see a lot of the social science, liberal arts historians, or students from those backgrounds, they do not put in their technology skills and how they use those technology skills to manage and communicate information. And I would urge you all to give your students opportunities to develop those technology skills in a wide variety of ways and put them on their resumes, because at the bottom of those resumes, they should be there. Anyway.
Thank you. Well, those are our 3 questions for Bob. We could do this for several more hours because it gets really interesting when you dive in. How do you translate these things? I gave him the case of the student of Dan's who'd written on the labor supply in the turpentine industry in the 19th century. Apparently it was highly employable given his experience, but you have to translate what it means to study post-slavery turpentine workers into something that an employer now who's interested in issues of labor change and things, you have to translate that into a language they understand. So if I can take your takeaways, know your audience, understand the way that they communicate, provide evidence that you too can communicate in that way, and show them that your thinking, your critical thinking skills are applicable to their industry. Is that fair?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm David Trowbridge. I'm a professor at Marshall University, and it's an honor to be here to share some of what I learned in 3 years with the Lumina Project's tuning project. On the first evening of our first meeting, as we came together, groups of historians, to talk about what are the skills of the historian and why should anyone care, we started sharing our own personal reasons for being part of this project. And it was interesting to hear that many of us were skeptical. I heard things like, I am a professor, not a peddler. We talked more about why we should care what companies think of what we're doing. But really it came down to, we care about our students. Our students are here largely for one reason. And if we don't understand, appreciate, and respond to that need, we will not have students, and we should not have students. My specialty is African American history. Therefore, I come to you as someone who has studied under the true greats in the field of education. People who turned one-room schoolhouses into universities, or taught people how to read so that they would challenge voter registration tests. They did not go to those people and say, I want you to challenge voter registration people, and some of you will probably die. They said, what would you like to learn, and why? You want to learn to read the Bible for yourself? You want to write a letter to your son before you die? We will teach you these things. And they did. They taught them those things. And then there was a relationship and a trust. And they challenged those voter registration tests and saved the republic. So on that first day, as we were all talking about why we were there, it occurred to me that the skills I learned in my history courses — I was not fortunate enough to be a history undergraduate — the skills I learned in my graduate education were the same skills I really needed in my 3 previous jobs for 3 of the largest corporations in the country. Taking information from a variety of sources, understanding that information and communicating it effectively was the bedrock of those 3 jobs. I am fortunate that I did not learn those skills as well as I might have, or I would not be here. I took a pay cut to become a history professor, but not a large one. Had my skills been better, the pay cut might have been larger, and I might not be here. I cannot throw or hit a 95-mile-an-hour fastball, so I have the best job I think I could ever have. I get to read books and share what I learn with incredible young people, and I get to tell the story of America. That's how I'm here. During the second day of the first meeting, we were talking a lot about what employers want. And Perfect segue, I thought, why not ask? And then I became curious. So I decided to invite a number of employers to Marshall University, and some AHA folks graciously also came to Marshall University, and we sat around a table for what ended up being 3 hours. The employers graciously accepted, not because they wanted to hear what historians had to say, but because we have a relationship at the university and they care about the university. I anticipated that this would be about a 45-minute meeting, and they would finish their Sodexo lunches that we so graciously provided for them, and they would be on their way. I was actually the first one to leave the room. I had to excuse myself after 3 hours because I had a class to teach. During that conversation, we learned a great deal, and we heard a number of things. One of the things we heard from employers for the first hour and 15 minutes was the phrase soft skills. Now, people might be familiar with that. We were not. It took, and we also knew that that none of us knew what it was, but none of us were willing to raise our hand and ask until eventually Jim Grossman raised his hand and said, I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the term soft skills. They described soft skills in a way that was one of the best defenses of liberal arts education I have ever heard in my life. We also heard things like attention to detail. Attention to detail. They didn't say that particular phrase, but it came down to some of the smallest things in the world, like dress up for your job interview, take the time to learn something about the company and know their history. After saying that a few times, they turned to us and said, your students are probably pretty good at that. We hope so. So these two first bullet points, attention to detail and soft skills, are what we heard really from first-line supervisors and the people who interviewed our students. The next written and oral communication, and the written and oral communication I kind of heard from second-line supervisors. I'm going to talk about message mapping here in a second, but written and oral communication, your students can't write very well. We can't hire someone who if they can't write an email that represents our company. Over there to the right on that slide is a study, I want to say 2007 from College Board that said American companies spend $3.1 billion every single year teaching their existing employers how to write. There is demand for our skills. I'll talk about message mapping here in a second. I wasn't familiar with that one either. The second to last, curiosity and adaptability. I heard that from CEOs. I heard it from every CEO, and every one of them used the word curiosity or intellectual curiosity. They also recommended 2 to 3 books on average. Sound familiar? Sound like anyone you ever talked to? The last bullet point, relationships and perspectives of others. I heard relationships from every retired executive. That was their message, relationships. I don't know that we do enough. In my business courses that I had many group projects. In my liberal arts courses and all through my PhD program, I never had a single group project. That's probably an area we could improve upon. Message mapping, right? So I got the chance to sit in on a session where a company showed us how they teach their people how to communicate a message, and this is just taken directly from my notes. It might look familiar. Core message, we'll call that, I don't know, a thesis. Supporting points, that's your framework, supported by evidence. That's what we teach. It's also what companies teach. I found message mapping so many times. Google it. You'll find this same slide over and over and over again. Here is Intuit, a major company that was willing to share their training with me. That's a message map right there. You see what details, facts, use that to frame an argument. So comments from executives I heard a lot. Find a job with people who are smarter than you and are willing to teach you. Curiosity, I heard that word. Our biggest decisions are based on history. That is, your history. That was a venture capital firm. Read, build, and adapt. We don't build things anymore, I heard a lot. The value of college is learning how to ask the right question. That was on my drive here with the CEO of Intuit within 30 seconds. That's what he told me. How do I communicate this with students? On the first day of my classes, I draw a diploma poorly on the board, and I ask them, what is this? And they basically laugh and say it's the most expensive piece of paper in the world. And we talk about that for a while, and then eventually I pull out my diploma. And I offer it to any of them. But there are conditions. You must take this piece of paper, and you must leave this room, and you must leave this university, and you must hit the job market right now with the skills you already have. I still have my college diploma. Communicating the value of history. We need to do more of this. I'm working on a video that will translate these skills with short examples. On the right here is the most expensive copy of the New York Times. I paid $40 for it. It is blank. This is my story for, I have a special copy of the newspaper where they took out all the stories that involved history, based on history. And the blank pages. A resume, it's a history. A job interview is a history. You go to see the doctor. What do they start with? A history. Trying to find new ways. Finally, what do I do with my students? I build things. Foxfire was about 50 years ago, a teacher was having a hard time working. He said, we're going to build a magazine. And it became an institution. For the last 8 years, I've built 2 books, a website, and a mobile application with my students. We're going to build something, and we're going to show the value of history with these things. My students put this on their resume. They share this, and now they have an answer to the question, tell me about a time you were challenged. And they can talk about their history courses in that way. This is a small example of some of the things that you can do, and I'm really looking forward to our conversations.
Hello, everyone. My name is Lauren Cohen. I currently work at an organization called Americans for the Arts, which is the nation's leading nonprofit for advancing the arts in America. I got my undergraduate degree in history at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville, and I earned my master's degree from James Madison University in public history. I graduated from there in 2012, so I've been out and about in the market for several years now, and I thought I would come here today and tell you a little bit about what I've learned since I've been out from my master's program. After I completed my MA in public history from James Madison, I felt like I could take the world by storm and go work at any museum I wanted to work at, because clearly I had every skill that any museum might ever want to have, and no one else had those skills but me. So clearly I was going to get any job I wanted, and I knew exactly which job I wanted since I was 14 years old. The first time I ever walked down the streets of Colonial Williamsburg, I knew that's where I wanted to work. And I fell in love with history and needed to work there. And after I completed my master's degree, I applied at Colonial Williamsburg and I landed the job. And so I knew this is clearly what I'm supposed to be doing. I was the Americana Foundation Fellow for the curatorial department there at Colonial Williamsburg for over a year, and it was incredible. I had amazing mentors. I learned so much, and I was confident that this is where I would work for the next 50 years. But then the fellowship ran out, and there was not a permanent job for me. So I really had to reevaluate, and I had a lot of trial and error. And I don't want to stand up here. I see so many of you are students now and thinking about where you're going to work, and I don't want to stand up here and be discouraging for you, but there was a lot of trial and error. I applied for a lot of jobs and had a lot of interviews that all came back with a very thin piece of paper, not a thick piece of paper, that said, "Thank you so much, you're very qualified, however." So that was really difficult for me to get through and really reevaluate what I was going to do, because again, I did all the right things, I got all the right degrees, and I worked where I wanted to work, but it wasn't happening for me. So I had to think outside the box a little bit. And so I actually saw a job posting for a position on Capitol Hill working for a member of Congress. This is not a job I ever thought I would want or have, but I applied. And the member of Congress actually was from my home state of Tennessee, and I went in for an interview, and the position I was applying for was a mid-level position. It was not entry-level. And for those of you who might not be familiar with Capitol Hill, people go there and have several unpaid internships, and then a paid internship, and then some with a law degree, they'll get an entry-level position, giving tours of the Capitol. So all of that was completely unknown to me when I applied for and interviewed for this mid-level position in a member of Congress's office. So I went in and talked about myself and talked about my experience at Colonial Williamsburg and my history degrees, which I thought were totally not applicable to this job on Capitol Hill. And the chief of staff who was interviewing me asked for a writing sample. That I could do. I submitted a writing sample from my master's thesis, which happened to be about 18th century trans-Appalachian migration, so people coming from the East Coast over into Tennessee. Very convenient since I was applying to work for a member of Congress from Tennessee. So I submitted that writing sample and actually landed the job. And on my first day of the job, I finally got to meet the member of Congress. I went into his office and he said, "Your writing sample was the only one I've actually ever read from an applicant." And he was thrilled. He asked me half a dozen questions about my research and how I did my research and other conclusions I had come to in my master's thesis, because I only submitted a very small portion of it. But he was thrilled with it. And I knew that I was in a good place, especially because later that afternoon, my chief of staff called me into his office and said, "This isn't what you originally applied for, but the member of Congress really wants you to handle his museums, arts, and humanities portfolio in the office." All of that came from the fact that I submitted a very good writing sample that I wrote and earned in my master's degree in history. So after several years in that office, I decided I really wanted to get back to my passion of history and museums and the humanities and the arts. And I made a lot of connections when I was on Capitol Hill and met the government relations person for the American Alliance of Museums. And he and I became friends, and one day he sent me an email and he was like, Americans for the Arts is looking for a government relations coordinator. I think you'd be a great candidate. I applied for the position, and now I'm the government relations coordinator at Americans for the Arts. So I am actually a registered lobbyist, which some of you might roll your eyes at, but I lobby for very good things. I lobby for the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and the Institute for Museum and Library Services. So I get to lobby for things that I am so passionate about, and I get to do that every day, and I would not be able to do this had I not spent time on Capitol Hill, which is somewhere I never thought I would be. So I get to return to my passion in a very different way, and I'm very, very proud of that. In my job at Americans for the Arts, I get to use my history skills in many, many ways, and lots of the ways we've already talked about here this morning, or this afternoon. But one way I can specifically think about from this past summer was I was able to offer my colleagues a historical contextualization of the recent conversations regarding monuments and statues as it relates to public art after the shocking and horrifying events in Charlottesville in August. So I was able to offer that historical perspective that would have otherwise been lacking in my organization. So I was very glad I was able to add to the conversation in that way. I'll speak just for a few minutes about what you actually are looking at in interviews when you are sitting in the room, when you've finally gotten a call for an interview. Interviewers appreciate when job candidates ask creative and critical questions, something more than just, oh, what do you like about your job? What do you like about this organization? They want to hear a more thoughtful question than that. And as historians, we're trained to analyze and synthesize and find the whole in what hasn't been asked or examined. That's what we're trained to do. So do that in your interview. This method should be applied to your applications, to your cover letters, and the interviews themselves. Norm and Bob, you talked about a lot of the things that I had thought to share with you all, but the skills that one acquires in conducting original research shows employers that the candidate possesses project management skills. That's a key word that people really want to read on your cover letter. Critical thinking, creativity. These are skills that can be harnessed in dozens of fields and are attractive to employers. Like I said, I never thought I would be working in government relations, let alone a lobbyist, but these are things that are critical to what I do every day. Historians have a no stone unturned mentality, and that translates to thorough research, attention to detail, and an overall sense of intellectual curiosity. That's something we've heard all afternoon here. These are earned skills that you have as historians. You have earned those skills, so use them, and they should really be emphasized in your interviews. So I stand here before you today a little bit of a failure in what I thought I was going to do, but very, very proud and glad to do what I do now for Americans for the Arts, because I get to do something every day that I really, really believe in. So I encourage you to think outside the box a little bit when you're sending out those applications, and you'll send out dozens. But think outside the box a little bit and see how you can help shape our American conversation with the skills that you've earned as a historian. Thanks very much. That's pretty hard to follow. Fortunately, Lauren and I actually have very similar backgrounds and experiences. I'm also a graduate of James Madison University, where I got a degree in history and public history. I immediately went on to grad school, where I won a fellowship to the Winter Tour program in Early American Material Culture at the University of Delaware. And although I'm now the curator of collections at George Mason's Gunston Hall, just down the road if you care to visit this weekend, where we talk about the concept of American rights at a historic house museum, I really wanted to focus on my first job interview experience right out of grad school, which happened in 2008, which, if you'll remember, was a pretty dire time in history and the arts. There was no money, there was going to be no money, and we were all collectively freaking out. I was very lucky to see a job come open, a research associate at George Washington's Mount Vernon, what I later described as a history detective job. We were given a project, a 3-year initiative, to catalog as many Washington objects from among 30,000 managed by the museum, and convey that backstory research into a 50-word label paired with an image and place it in an online database. I managed my own time, but also worked with conservators, professional photographers, and data entry specialists who populated the back-end database that hosted our work. The hiring process, you should know, and this is not atypical, took about 9 months. It started in January of 2008 and ended with a start date in September of that year. Then and now, I actually take about 10 to 25 hours per job application, which some might consider pretty excessive, but I do encourage you to do more than just a quick overview or tweaking of your materials. And outside of the time I take to prepare for the in-person interview, I really researched the place, the people, and the job that's described in the posting itself. I submitted my cover letter and 2-page resume as a PDF. Please never submit your things as a Word document.
and soon after enjoyed a phone interview, but then I wasn't actually interviewed in person until August of that year. Now, perhaps because I'm a historian, or as my husband might like to call it, a professional hoarder, but now I hoard other people's things, only sometimes my own, I did find my notes from that first interview among my effects late last week. And they give us some really interesting insight into what happened 10 years ago. Half of the hour-and-a-half interview was spent discussing my interest in the position, how they felt I was best suited to fill it, and the specialist knowledge that I brought to the table, and how I acquired that in undergrad and grad school. But the other half was a behavioral interview. Employers want to know about your past behavior in particular situations. I now do the hiring in my job, and I am less interested in what you know. And if you already have an interview, it means you're already qualified. So I want to know if I want to work with you 8 to 10 hours of my 24-hour day, 5 to 6, maybe even 7 days a week. I spend more time with you than I do my own family, and I want to do so willingly. So what is a behavioral interview? Have you guys heard of that term before? For those who haven't, it helps me best understand how you're going to respond to something kind of in the moment. And one way to prepare for them is to come up with several situational inquiries, reach out to your professors and your mentors, and literally write out very short responses following the STAR interview technique. Present your situation, the task you were given, the action you took, and the result that happened, and report about it, maybe even in 4 tweets. Brevity is your friend. In an interview, it means that your employers can ask more questions about you and you them. And I have to admit, it's really difficult after spending 4, 6, for some of you 10+ years learning how to write out a clear, conductive argument in 30 pages. That doesn't fly in the museum field when you're writing label texts that are 50 words long. So tweeting is your friend in many respects. It's good practice. Sometimes this also means that the material that you present isn't really something that should be presented at a college-level writing style. Most of the labels that we write in museums are at a 5th grade reading level. It's pretty alarming when you come out of school and you're like, but I'm so smart, and you really are. And your audience is too, but not everyone reads at that level. It does not convey what you need it to. And there are great programs online, and they're free. Copy and paste your text into it. Simplify your vocabulary and your sentence structure, and it will make you a better communicator. Now, at the end of your interview, there are always time for questions at the end. Be prepared with something, anything. As Lauren pointed out, really probing, thoughtful questions are appreciated. Is the organization growing? What projects are on the horizon? Do they support professional development? Mind the time that you have. And then finally, always ask about the salary. It's something that I did in that position. It's not always listed on the job, and that is not always the fault of the employer. Please don't think that they're trying to undermine you or undervalue you. But if you're sitting in front of them, I guarantee you they have an answer. Ask it. Now, a couple of things to know going into these experiences. It will take a while for you to land that first job, and that's okay. Don't take it personally, just keep soldiering on. I wish I could give you guys a list of buzzwords that you could plug into all of your resumes, your cover letters, and your interview preparatory notes, but there is no such thing. Fortunately, you come with a great manual, and it's called the job posting. We are trained to go into journals, books, and mine everything you possibly can, from facts to citations, and then follow that lead. Do so with those postings, and use those action words in your own materials. It will not only help you with web crawlers, but it'll help you effectively communicate clearly and directly exactly what your employer is looking for. Use their language in your favor. And more than likely, and this is a tough sell, Your first job probably won't be open-ended or managerial. You will be offered a position that is really to accomplish a specific set of tasks. And although you're thirsty, that's where that passion is, and you want to stretch your wings and prove your worth, you have to do so first by accomplishing exactly what you're hired for. Master that, and you'll be given the next opportunity. And lastly, do not buy a suit. You'll never wear it. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Haley Horn, and I am a very recent history grad. I graduated from Marshall University in Huntington, West Virginia in 2015 with a bachelor's degree. So I only have a few years of experience to tell you about, but I'm very excited to be here and tell you about my post-grad journey so far and how my history degree has led me to where I am today. So I became a history major during my junior year of undergrad after trying my hand at pre-professional biology and sociology and education. None of those worked out for me. But when I started taking history courses and became a history major, I learned that I always thought like a historian. I just never knew it. And the great thing about going to a small liberal arts college is that my professors really caught on to the way that I think and my passion for history and did everything in their power to help me develop skills of a historian in a very short amount of time. So, after 2 semesters in the history department at Marshall, Dr. Trowbridge offered me an internship with an app that he had just created. It's called Clio. You may have heard of it. It's still on the screen. And I gladly accepted because the semester prior I took his African American Studies course and had the most amazing experience with our course assignment was to add 5 entries into Clio pertaining to African American history. The app was still pretty new, so there weren't a lot of entries in there yet. And I chose to focus on my home county of Fayette County, West Virginia. And all signs led me to one woman, Jean Evans Moore, who owns a museum called Du Bois on Main, which focuses on preserving and educating people about an African American school in Fayette County prior to integration. And this was my first experience of doing history, you know? So I walked into her museum one day unannounced, and she dropped everything and spent 7 hours with me teaching me the history of this school, and she was just so excited that someone was there wanting to learn about this and that could help her publicize it. And now I'm actually a member of her board at her museum, so that's pretty cool. But yeah, so this was my first experience doing history. And this internship and other history classes at Marshall taught me that research is so much more than just sitting in a library and reading books. It is communicating with people. It's cold calling people. It's listening to people's stories. It's being skeptical. It's writing something 50 times over because you know it's not good enough. And it's reaching out to your professors and your peers and asking them for help and advice. But most importantly, what all these classes in this internship taught me is that I was good at it. I was good at doing history. I had finally found something I was good at, and that was the reason why I was able to develop these skills so quickly and really use them in the job market. So like I said, I graduated from Marshall in 2015, and I went out in the job market hoping that my bright, shiny, and new history degree would get me the job of my dreams, kind of like Lauren. And I was quickly shot down, I spent the next year and 3 months working the same job I had in undergrad. I applied to over 80 positions in that time. I landed about 7 interviews, and they were all ended in the same result: we love you, but. So I went to career services. I was like, what is wrong with me? Why won't anyone hire me? And I submitted my cover letters and resumes to her because I would research each organization or company I applied for, rewrite my cover letter, rewrite my resume for each position. And they were like, you're fine, you just need to keep chipping away at it. So, you know, they weren't right, so. I learned that I could write about my history skills, but going into the interview, I could not communicate that these skills could apply to that position because I wasn't taught how to in undergrad. And that's probably because I didn't take many history courses. I was there for a short amount of time, like I said. But also, these positions weren't history positions. I was just like trying to make some money, get out of debt. You know, we've all been there. So there weren't any history jobs where I lived. And luckily, Dr. Trowbridge noticed that there weren't any history jobs for his graduate students, and so he created one. And that is amazing. So the position was an AmeriCorps position with the Clio Foundation through the Preservation Alliance of West Virginia, and it has made all the difference. It is why I'm standing in front of you today. My AmeriCorps experience taught me to take every opportunity that is presented to you. Never say no. It's going to scare the hell out of you. Do it anyway. That's what I'm doing today. But with this position, I got to wake up every day and do history like I did with Jean. And I developed more skills last year than most students do in a graduate program because I was actually in the field gaining experiences. My technical title was AmeriCorps Corps member, but it should have been researcher, writer, editor, project manager, community organizer, marketing specialist, volunteer manager. The list could go on. And I served the entire state of West Virginia as opposed to just one city. So I learned to write for a very diverse audience. And I was working with small institutions, large institutions. I walked right up to our state senator at an event and just introduced Clio to him, which is something, you know, you don't get that if just writing a research paper in undergrad. And I also just walked right up to the CEO of Intuit, too. So that's pretty cool. This is really embarrassing, but I'm going to tell you. I also learned through AmeriCorps that nonprofits were a thing. I had no idea that they existed. Well, I mean, I knew they existed, but I didn't know like how they worked, what they did, or that you could work for them and there was a career path in that. And luckily, I learned that because that's the path I'm still on today. So because I was doing all of these things, I finally learned how to communicate my history skills. And I didn't have to go back into the job market. So I applied, my first job application after AmeriCorps was to Service Year Alliance here in DC, which was a big stretch for me because where I'm from, people don't get out. But I was like, I'm gonna do it. So I applied and I landed the interview and I was able to communicate those skills. I messed up big time during my interview with him, and I was for sure that I did not get the job. So I am a marketing and communications fellow at Service Year, and after 2 hours of interviews, they asked me to do a writing project. I had already submitted a writing sample. And part of my responsibility now is to manage our social media and write articles for NACE and other organizations. So I was to draft in 250 words, convincing a young person to do a service year. And I had already done this with my service year through Clio. I had created a hashtag, West Virginia History Sunday. I was like, this is awesome. I'm just gonna throw all my posts in there. They're gonna be so impressed. It's gonna be great. No, my supervisor who was doing the interview, I had to present to him my social media drafts in 250 words. And he shot me down after 2 sentences. He was like, this is not what we wanted you to do. And he's like, I'll give you 15 minutes to write something brand new, and I'll come back. And I was like, okay. So that's where my history skills really came in. I was able to write something that actually made sense in 15 minutes and impress him, and I got the job. And I also asked my other supervisor, I was like, why, do you remember anything from my interview? Like, why did you pick me? And she said it was because I was comfortable. I was comfortable and confident in my history skills, and I convinced them that I could use those skills to tell the stories of service year alums and tell the stories of those currently serving. So now that's what I do. I work in technology with a history degree. Really, I have a job in social media, which is very cool. It's every millennial's dream, I think, to like Snapchat all day. So, yeah, so that is what I do. I get to equip young people with the materials they need to be successful, and I see lots of students here, so afterwards, I know I don't have that much time. If you would like to talk about service year opportunities, feel free to come find me. So, thank you.
Be gentle. I said to Bob, I get to comment on what we've been chatting because I'm old. My name is Ron Painter, and I am the CEO for something called the National Association of Workforce Boards. There are about 550 local business-led workforce boards across the U.S. and the territories. The responsibilities of the board start with understanding their regional labor market. There are over 100 million transactions a year in the U.S. labor market. So understanding the dynamics of what kind of skills are being utilized in a particular region starts for the boards with understanding what industries and businesses are critical to that region. And from there, what does that business do? We see through our retail outlets called American Job Centers about 15 million people a year. So that's probably matched by tens and tens of thousands of employers across the U.S., these kind of conversations that have been happening about what are you looking for. And so there are a couple things that I want to emphasize. One is that in our world of looking at how the U.S. labor market works and how American talent is competitive in a global economy starts with competence. It's almost, I don't mean it in a denigrating way, but credentials are almost a cottage industry here in DC. Everybody's involved in trying to figure out what does education mean. And I will put in a plug. Oftentimes I'm sitting in rooms, and my job as the CEO is to not only work with the 550 boards, but I do an enormous amount of work with the administration and on Capitol Hill. So part of my job is to try to translate to staff and members of Congress why the investment of probably just shy of $100 billion in the federal budget is critical. And that goes all the way from our arguing for early learning funds to our arguing for senior community employment and everything in between, including Pell. So we have to understand the dynamics of what is happening in the labor force and how talent in the U.S. is created and maintained. And part of that comes back to this notion of competence. I think it was stated, Debra stated it very well. There is a lack of confidence that a diploma means anything that the employer needs. So the employer translates their world into this notion of competencies. And I have to come back to Bob's point and emphasize that the word employer is not a monolithic. It's not a monolithic entity. You are not going to go out and interview and everybody's going to look like Intuit or Google or Amazon, or they may look like a 5-person company that's producing advanced materials that are used around the world. So you're going to have to do, and I like the point, you're going to have to do your research. When I'm interviewing somebody, you're right. The reason I see your resume is because somebody in the organization has already figured out you're qualified. So what I'm looking for when I'm talking to you are those questions at the end. You are my external eyes. How do you see NAWB? How do you see this world of labor markets? How do you see what's happening out there with employers? And what are those kind of questions? Because you may be the most valuable teacher I have that day, or that week, or that month. And that's going to convince me that you're somebody I need to figure out. I do have to pause when I'm saying teacher, because one of the reasons I was so excited to be a part of the panel is not only because of what AHA is doing on the tuning project, which I think is absolutely some of the best work that's going on out there, is that as you read Bob Sheets's bio, one of the things that it probably doesn't say in there is mentor. There's not a whole lot of people who do what I do that do not look back at conversations, work, and participating with Bob on projects. So it is it's pretty cool for me to get to hang out a couple hours with somebody I respect a lot. But Bob mentioned, you're going to have to do some research on this company. Understand that not all companies are enormous. So when you walk into a company, I agree, it's this notion of how do you convince them of what it is you can do. And I think that's part of what I like about the tuning project. It's part of what I encourage you if you're an instructor, is to make sure that students understand what it is they can do. Oftentimes, when I'm hanging out with large corporations, I'm hanging out with the HR staff, but then we're also trying to bring in somebody from production, whether that's a good or a service, to talk about what's happening out there, what kind of skills are you seeing that you're using, because, again, no offense, many times the HR office is not connected to what happens on Monday morning. They're connected to how does their system work? I was just with a manufacturing company, advanced manufacturing company, 30,000 resumes a month they have to process. They do it all electronically. So Bob's point about knowing what's in the summary at the top of that resume is so critical right now. Now, there's also a great conversation in our world now about the limits of electronic resume systems and keyword analysis and all of that. But don't take away from that it's not important. What you put at the top of that resume or what you help students craft at the top of that resume is really, really critical. And it needs to be connected to what this company, what this organization is about. But I got back to that because there's a really cool project that I got connected to what you're doing at AAH through, and that's out of Henry Ford Community College in Michigan, where they work with employers on something called PBOs, performance-based outcomes. And the idea was that the individual had a credential, whatever it was, whether in manufacturing it was a CNC, or whether it was welding, or whether it was a liberal arts degree. But the student understood what it is they knew. So when they were in the interview, they could tell the person that they were interviewing, on Monday morning, this is what I can do for you. So in the case that we were looking at with some of the advanced manufacturing, it all had to do with valves and it had to do with piping. So the student talked about their ability to understand, first of all, what the valves, what the digits were telling them as they were watching the dashboard. But secondly, they could then walk back through and problem solve. They could talk about how the system was working from beginning to end. An enormous advantage to the employer, because now production's not going to stop, because I have somebody who understands the entire process. So I think it's really critical. The other thing that's also happening out there is work-based learning. Work-based learning is having a renaissance in the US. A lot of my time is spent hanging out with people who are talking about apprenticeships. And while you may think apprenticeships is traditionally like, how many of you think of the building trades when you think of apprenticeship? Somebody's going to be a bricklayer, right? They're going to be a plumber, they're going to be a steam fitter, they're going to be a glazer. How about thinking about insurance? How about thinking Intuit and Amazon, and thinking about Google, and thinking about healthcare? Occupations, industries today are trying to find that apprenticeship model across all kinds of industries because it really becomes their skill. They're teaching their skill, and you're going to serve a period of apprenticeship. In our world, we're spending a lot of money on on-the-job training contracts and on apprenticeship. So I'm going to suggest, as the example of having an internship, that if you're a professor or, and you're working with your students, really encourage that internship. Here in Washington, as Lauren pointed out, we pay all the interns we have. We'd like to talk to you about interns if you have them. We deal with public policy. We deal with data. If you think about our members, we have about 400 members across the country. Generally, I'll get 180 that will answer a 10-question survey. That's at the base 1,800 responses that we have to figure out how to synthesize. And when I say synthesize, the other part of that is not only do we have to look at our members, I have to figure out what they're saying on Capitol Hill, and then we've got to figure out what they're saying in business. And how is what we're doing matched against what's happening on the political level, what's happening out in business. So there is a great deal of data massage that's going on. But take that internship. Encourage your students to grab an internship, even if it's not paid, which I do not agree with. But even if it isn't, take that internship, because that's real-world experience. It is the opportunity to produce something. One of the pleasures I've had in life is to be adjunct faculty. I use that a lot when I'm on the road because audiences sometimes get restless, and I tell them, don't worry, I taught at night. So if you got to check your cell phone, check your cell phone. I just keep going. But I used the very simple IRAC. A friend of mine had told me that was a technique they used in their class. A one-page brief on what was the issue, what were the rules and regulations, what was the analysis, and what was the conclusion. I can't tell you how many times today I have to produce a one-page brief for one of the 24 board members that I have that's going out in their local community to speak about the labor market, going to speak about competencies, going to speak about what's happening in Washington as we look at the 2018 elections. So take the opportunity to figure out, can you write what you want to write in 50 words and make it coherent? And also remember, when you go in for that interview, if it's a large corporation, you got to figure out who's there that's actually doing, because that's who you need to interview too. You got to convince that person that on Monday morning, I know not only how to come to work, but I know what work is on Monday morning. American business does not have the luxury of having a lot of people hang around anymore. Most, including nonprofits, which are 13%, by the way, of the US GDP, flows through nonprofit corporations. We're working with a nonprofit right now. If you think we're all small, our budget's about $2.2 million. That doesn't make us huge. We're working with an organization that's a nonprofit of a $40 million budget. Many of our workforce boards' budgets are in the 20 to 30 million range. Some of them are well over $100 million. So think about that. The other thing I'd encourage you to teach your students and think about is, in this city, my business card is important, but it doesn't matter, frankly, whose name is on that business card. This is a city where people find you when they need to find the skill. Writing to the specifications of government grants, writing to the specifications of foundation grants. So doing the research, doing the history research. What is the foundation given in the past? What are we looking at in terms of this issue? What efforts have already gone on in Congress to try to change policies? Those are things that are very critical, and people who can write, in some cases, don't work for organizations, they work for themselves. So I think I would encourage you to make sure that students understand that working for themselves, particularly in an economy where gig workers are a growing part of the economy, that they understand how to do that. So I'd encourage you to take back to your schools, if you're not teaching entrepreneurship, figure out how you do it in your department. Even if they end up, one of the most successful apprenticeship projects I ever saw was out in the Valley in California. 2 years, organic farming apprenticeship. 90% of them never started their own farm, never operated their own land. They were extremely valuable to companies because they understood the entrepreneurships, what Bob was talking about earlier, this notion of innovation which has got to drive American corporations to stay ahead. I've talked to a couple of people on my board who probably literally have hired 100,000 people in their career, said, tell me the 3 things that you would suggest are critical, and we've heard them. I don't hire somebody for the first job. I hire them for, can they learn? Do they have a history of learning? Do I believe that they can learn not only the job I gave them, can they learn the next job? because it's far easier for me and far cheaper for me to promote somebody from within than to try and do an external job search. So convince them you've learned, convince them you can learn, you are learning. Take that e-learning course that maybe has nothing to do with what you're doing, but it demonstrates that you're out there learning. Secondly, do they have the essential skills? We heard about the soft skills. It's the #1 reason that your students, if you're a professor or if you're a student, it's the #1 reason you're going to get fired. It's the #1 reason. Inability to work with other people, inability to take direction, inability to take criticism. Got to demonstrate how you have maneuvered through that. And then finally, kind of a touchy one, and that is, do you have, can I see, and I think it was mentioned, can I see working with you? Can I see you fit inside this organization? So you got to understand, again, in the interview, what's the culture of the organization that you're coming in to deal with? If you're coming into an interview with me, you better understand what's going on in the ACC. I'm a University of Pittsburgh grad, a proud University of Pittsburgh grad. So the first thing I'm going to talk to you about is the ACC, and then I'm going to talk to you about the 6 Super Bowls that the Pittsburgh Steelers have. And then I'm going to talk about the back-to-back Stanley Cups, and then we'll talk about what NAWB does. But anyway, the other thing, if you're a professor, I'm going to encourage you. There are 550 workforce boards across the U.S. Connect to the board that's in your territory. They're talking to hundreds of employers in the course of a year. Hundreds of opportunities for employment and an internship. So I want to reinforce, you got some great advice from folks up here. Know yourself, know the market, know the company.
Thank you all very much. Lots of themes we heard echoing, which is always really exciting to see. We have a few minutes for questions for any of the panelists, and I'd like to open up the floor. And when you ask your questions, say who you are and where you're from, just so we can get to know each other. Questions, comments? Yes? Excellent point about every single level, there's an additional set of activities you have to deal with. Any comments about the...
No, I think it's a great, I'm glad you mentioned that. What I'm seeing in the other discipline areas is people who've taken a professional career track, getting and networking with each other, and they're going to learn more from peers about how to present themselves and the opportunities, because what you want to create is people get jobs through networks. And right now, I'd love to see it so that we have in every disciplinary area, we have a professional network of people who are alums of your own institutions or others who you can learn from how they're presenting themselves professionally, the track they took, and how they communicated from day one, and also how they prepare themselves, not just to present themselves through their resumes or electronically, but also the behavioral-based interviewing. And I think they learn most peer-to-peer. And that's why I think it's great. I'd love to see other discipline, your all's area and others, produce more of a network of professionals in your own disciplines and promote that network.
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I was with a company not too long ago that's in the upper Midwest, and they no longer recruit in the South. If it doesn't snow where the university is, they don't recruit, because what they have done internally is looked at who is successful in this company, what engineers come here and stay here.
Wow.
And they've realized that warm weather engineers come, but they don't stay. So they only have a limited budget to go out and do campus recruiting. So they are no longer going to schools in the South. I've also sat with companies that have gone back through and looked at their employees. To Bob's point about relationships, they know the 6 universities where they have successful employees. And that's their first, they look at those resumes first. So your grad students that can network and you can help build that bridge to people who are already working could be a very critical key, because they're working in an organization that knows the school, values the school, and if Bob will stand up for me, by gosh, you're hired.
Yeah, and that's the most leading employers, because they get how many thousands of resumes. They're doing performance analytics on their top performers. And the problem is that we need to have it so that on the supply side, we're understanding what they're learning. Yep. And if we understand what they're learning, then we're going to prepare that professional network even better and better to get. So I think the most important thing is that peer-to-peer, but also employers, getting employers to talk about the performance analytics they're doing on your graduates and figuring out what they're learning about what makes them top performers.
So the American Historical Association, of course, has been working in this area for quite a while. There was an article a few years ago. It was called "No More Plan B," as in we need our people to stop referring to a career outside of academia as Plan B. Ironically, that tends to sort of reinforce the idea, just as the wonderful article "History is Not a Useless Major" has sort of put useless right next to. The reason I bring this up. The #1 book in Silicon Valley, as recommended to me by CEOs and vice presidents of Silicon Valley companies, is Getting to Plan B. This idea that none of us really know what we're doing. Being a history professor was not my Plan B, it was my Plan G. And what impressed me most with our 3 recent majors is they're on Plan C, D, or E, but the skill set. I can't imagine a better job training program for the careers that matter and are going to be around for the next 50 years than a PhD in history.
I think we have time for maybe one final question. Final comment? Actually, Norm, why don't you have the final word?
Well, this is just an observation. I was department head for 18 years. I've hired a lot of historians. Everything we've said about the non-academic sector is absolutely true if you're trying to get a job in the academic sector, including and especially the soft skills part. Joining an academic department is much like joining a monastery. You may be there your entire life. And the rest of the monks would like to have someone they'd like to see occasionally. And when you see, the job in American history, 250 applications, how on earth do you sort those out? It's exactly the same things we've been talking about for everybody. We're looking for that response to the ad that says, I understand what you do, I can do this for you, I can do it in a new and different and interesting way, and I'm fun to have lunch with. If you don't tell us that, you're not likely to survive the interview process.
Join me in thanking our And a special thank you to Dan McInerney for pulling us all together. Thanks, Dan.